On the 21st of June 2023, Dr. Jenny Bulstrode, lecturer in the History of Science and Technology at the University College London, published an article entitled Black Metallurgists and the Making of the Industrial Revolution in the well-respected scholarly journal History and Technology. Bulstrode's article challenged the long-held view that 19th century British ironmaster Henry Cort had invented a method for recycling low-quality scrap iron into more valuable wrought iron. Instead, Bulstrode asserted, Cort had stolen this idea from, quote, black metallurgists in Jamaica who developed it, end quote, crediting them as the true innovators of the process and identifying them as a combination of free and enslaved workers. Bulstrode's paper was widely reported by organisations such as New Scientist, The Guardian and National Public Radio. However, she was soon challenged by scholars asserting her sources did not support her claims. What followed was an extended dialogue of claim and counterclaim between academics. This video examines the history Bulstrode interpreted, the controversy over her interpretation, and the question of who non-specialists should believe when qualified professionals cannot agree. Bulstrode's claims. Aside from her more controversial claims, Bulstrode's article brought attention to an important agreed-on historical fact not widely known among the public: the high quality of metallurgical knowledge and skill located in West and Central Africa during the 18th and 19th centuries. Citing European sources such as an 18th century Danish merchant who commented, quote, "Their iron is much harder than ours," end quote, Bulstrode describes how these African metallurgists, quote, produced and exported iron of superior quality to Europe, end quote. Bulstrode explains how African slaves with this expertise were brought to plantation colonies such as those in Jamaica and North America, where their knowledge was highly valuable. She describes how the low-quality pig iron produced in these plantations could be improved significantly, quote, using the skill of enslaved black artificers, end quote, and quotes Lieutenant Governor of Virginia saying that when this pig iron was combined with English iron, it could produce iron, quote, as tough and good as the Swedish, end quote. According to Bulstrode, this skill was seen as such a threat to British metal manufacturing that the British Parliament responded to it by banning industrial-scale iron and steel working in its American colonies. Bulstrode adds this was, quote, subsequently reinforced by restrictions on the movement of artisans and export of machinery, end quote. However, smaller-scale production was still permitted, and British iron manufacturers managed this by subcontracting work to teams of local workers, many of whom were black, either free or enslaved. Thus, Bulstrode informs us, quote, iron produced under the contract system depended on the skill of black metallurgists, free, enslaved, and maroon, end quote. It's important to note that not all black people in the colonies were slaves, even in this period. Although the capture and enslavement of black people at this time should never be overlooked or diminished, it is also important to recognise the free black labourers who were salaried, contracted, or otherwise sought after on their own terms for their skills and knowledge. Bulstrode reaches the core of her argument when she introduces British businessman John Reeder, who started an iron foundry in Jamaica. As was the established custom, Reeder subcontracted the work to local black metallurgists. Bulstrode comments that although Reeder, quote, sent to England to engage 60 white artificers for the instruction of black metallurgists in using this specialist machinery, end quote, a few years later, the black metallurgists were so skilled and knowledgeable that Reed dispensed with all but 2 of the white staff. In correspondence, Reeder explained how he had overcome the problem of locating skilled labour, citing his black workers and commenting, quote, many of which are perfect in every branch of the iron manufactory, end quote. According to Bulstrode, a critical advantage of Reed's iron foundry was his ability to recycle low-quality scrap iron into high-quality wrought iron. Bulstrode argues this used a process which Henry Cort would later attempt to claim was his own invention. Bulstrode attributes this process directly to the black metallurgists, asserting that it was they who, quote, tied scrap iron in bundles like sugarcane, heated the bundles in the reverberatory furnace, and then fed them through grooved rollers like those found in a sugar mill, end quote, adding, quote, in doing so, they transformed scrap metal into valuable bar iron, end quote. At this point, it must be recognised that regardless of whether or not this specific claim of Bulstrode is correct, the skill of African metallurgists in both Africa and the British colonies, and their various contributions to the iron industry of the Industrial Revolution, is well established. See the list of references linked in the video description for various sources on this topic. Bulstrode describes how Henry Cort applied for a patent in 1783 to protect what he claimed was an original process of his own invention for recycling scrap iron into wrought iron. Bulstrode explains, quote, for commentators then and since, the striking innovation of the 1783 patent specification was its focus on scrap iron, and where Cort followed careful bundling and heating with feeding the bundles through grooved rollers, end quote. Bulstrode writes, quote, what Cort and subsequent commentators claimed to be innovative was the specific combination of processes brought together in bundling scrap metal and crude pig iron, heating it in an air furnace that burned raw pit coal, and then passing it through grooved rollers to produce valuable bar iron, end quote. Bulstrode asserts that while Cort claimed this innovation was the product of his own hard work, research, and financial investment, quote, no account has been found of what the alleged study, labour, or experiments might have involved, end quote. She adds, quote, when questioned years on as to the costs involved, he seems not to have known, end quote. It is Bulstrode's assertion that this process, in particular the distinctive use of grooved rollers, was first used by Reeder's black metallurgists, and that Cort discovered this innovation, appropriated it, and then attempted to patent it as his own invention. Bulstrode notes Reed's foundry had 2 air furnaces, a rolling mill, and grooved rollers, and consequently had all the components necessary to create this process. Additionally, Bulstrode asserts, Reeder's black metallurgists, quote, had been transforming scrap metal and crude pig iron into valuable bar iron before Cort even entered the iron business, end quote, and attributes this to the process she posits the black metallurgists invented and Cort later stole. Bulstrode's claims are challenged. On the 24th of August 2023, an article critiquing Bulstrode's paper was published in SOC Archive Papers. This is a non-profit online open access platform allowing people to upload papers on social science, making them publicly available to other researchers. SOC Archive relies on an entirely post-publication peer review model, prioritizing making research available without having to pass through the typical barriers to publication in scholarly journals. The aim is to get as much research out into the public arena as possible, where its merits will then be evaluated in a public forum by any other researchers who feel inclined to read and assess the work. However, this means that SOC Archive does not peer review articles prior to publication, so they appear online without having passed through a standard academic editorial quality control process. Consequently, you should always be very careful of papers on the platform. You can't trust them to be accurate since no one has checked them before they have been published. SOC Archive's model works well as long as people using the site understand how it works and do not treat articles on the site as authoritative or peer-reviewed prior to publication. The critique of Bulstrode's work, entitled The Origin of Henry Cort's Iron Rolling Process, Assessing the Evidence, written by an author identified as Oliver Jelf, claimed, quote, the principal primary sources, reproduced in the appendix, do not support the contention that Cort acquired the process from enslaved black metal workers at John Reeder's foundry in Jamaica, nor that the foundry was dismantled and shipped to Portsmouth for Cort's benefit, end quote. The article further asserted, quote, the sources instead suggest that ordinary and widespread iron-making processes were in use at Reeder's foundry, that no innovation occurred there, that the chain of events by which Cort is supposed to have heard of the foundry's activities certainly did not occur, that Reeder's foundry was destroyed because of the threat of a Franco-Spanish invasion force, and that no part of the foundry was removed from the immediate vicinity of the island, let alone taken to Portsmouth, end quote. This was a direct contradiction of specific claims made in Bulstrode's paper. Since the article was not peer-reviewed prior to publication, it's worth asking who Oliver Jelf is, and this proved to be something of a mystery at first. On the 23rd of November 2023, the editors of History and Technology, the journal in which Bulstrode's paper had been published, explained that Jelf had initially sent his article to them, but they had decided not to publish it. The editors noted that Jelf was, quote, identified on the preprint as a master's student, end quote, but that, quote, the paper and author provide no indication of the author's past or present academic or institutional affiliations, and history and technology has been unable to ascertain this information, end quote. It's worth noting that Bulstrode held a PhD from Cambridge University and a lecturing position at the University College London, and it's likely the editors felt uncertain about challenging her work with a paper written by someone whose academic qualifications, affiliations, and previous academic work they could not determine. On the 28th of September 2023, Professor of History David Wootton published a blog post on Bulstrode's paper in which he noted Jelf, quote, has never published a book or a refereed article, end quote, further observing, quote, this essay appears on SOC Archive, which means it has been moderated but not refereed, end quote, by which he means it hadn't passed through peer review. However, Wootton also noted that the content of Jelf's article indicated he had knowledge of the topic and implied his critique may eventually prove significant. On the 28th of November 2023, historian Anton Howes, who specialises in the Industrial Revolution and the history of innovation, provided more information about Jelf, who Howes said had contacted him in August about his paper. Howes explained at that time Jelf was, quote, completing his dissertation for a research master's from Buckingham University, and otherwise a graphic designer, end quote. Jelf's academic identity and credentials are not important for deciding whether or not his critique is correct, but are important for verifying he is a real person, verifying his scholarly credentials, and identifying any possible conflicts of interest. Journals are less likely to publish articles if this information is not provided by authors. So what evidence did Jelf provide for his critique? Bulstrode's argument rested partly on the fact that Reader's Foundry was successfully converting scrap metal into bar iron. Jelf observes that the conversion of scrap or pig iron into wrought or bar iron was not itself a novelty, citing Charles Wood's foundry in Cumberland, England, which had already invented a process of making wrought iron from pig iron and was using it successfully at least as early as 1753, around 20 years earlier than Reader's Foundry. Wood received a patent for his process in 1766, again, a good 15 years before Reader's Foundry was recycling scrap iron. Jelf notes the wrought iron produced by Wood's process was notable for its hardness and quality, citing primary sources from 1766 and 1775. Consequently, it is clear that the technology for converting low-quality scrap iron into high-quality wrought iron or bar iron already existed long before Reader's Foundry was recycling scrap iron. However, Bulstrode's claim is not simply that Reader's Foundry was converting scrap iron to wrought iron, but that it was using a superior process to those used by earlier ironworkers such as Wood, specifically the process using grooved rollers, which Henry Cort later claimed was his own invention. Jelf addresses this directly, writing, quote, a key claim vital to Bulstrode's argument is that the foundry, that is Reader's Foundry, was equipped with water-powered rolling mills, where workers fed scrap iron through grooved rollers, end quote. However, he adds, quote, rolling mills are not referred to in Reader's letters, and no mention is made of any kind of roller, end quote. Jelf further observes, quote, despite frequent use of citations throughout Bulstrode's paper, they are conspicuously absent from any of her confident statements about the use of grooved rollers until the following assertion appears towards the end of the paper. They had a rolling mill, and they had grooved rollers, end quote. Jelf then examines the historical evidence Bulstrode provides for her claim that Reader's Foundry owned these grooved rollers, writing, quote, here Bulstrode provides two sources. As evidence for the presence of a rolling mill, she cites the deed for Reader's use of the land in 1772, kept in the Jamaica Records Office, which states that Reader purchased land by a river for the purpose of erecting mills with a waterwork for the smelting and other manufacture of iron and other metals, end quote. On which he comments, quote, this does not by itself prove the presence of a rolling mill, since water was also used to power forge hammers and bellows, but in any case, such a mill would not have been unusual, end quote. Jelf then explains, quote, as evidence for the use of grooved rollers, Bulstrode cites a petition from Reader's daughter Eliza to the British Parliament, end quote. However, he argues, quote, the document makes absolutely no mention of a rolling mill or of grooved rollers and is entirely irrelevant to Bulstrode's point, end quote. Jelf concludes his commentary on this argument of Bulstrode by writing, quote, Bulstrode offers no further evidence to support her assertion that Reeder's foundry processed scrap iron using grooved rollers. The claim has no basis in fact, end quote. Jelf then moves on to examine Bulstrode's claim that it was Reeder's black metallurgists who invented the improved scrap metal recycling process, writing, quote, It is these workers to whom Bulstrode credits the groundbreaking invention later patented by Cort. We have seen that no such process was in use at the foundry, but let us nonetheless consider if these men were likely to have developed a similar technique in the way that Bulstrode suggests, end quote. He quotes the relevant section of Bulstrode's paper, which reads thus, quote, The black metallurgists who ran John Reeder's foundry saw its old European technology in the light of their present experiences and living histories. They were not bound by European classificatory conventions, and their practices and purposes were their own. They tied scrap iron in bundles like sugarcane, heated the bundles in the reverberatory furnace, and then fed them through grooved rollers like those found in a sugar mill. In doing so, they transformed scrap metal into valuable bar iron, end quote. Jelf observes that this brief narrativization by Bulstrode, quote, stands in marked contrast with the many technical details contained within Cort's initial patent, end quote, adding that Bulstrode, quote, imagines that, for these black workers, sugar and iron shared much overlapping conceptual space, and thus they were inspired to replicate the use of grooved rollers found in sugar mills with astounding results, end quote. Jelf critiques Bulstrode's historical reconstruction, stating, quote, she offers no evidence for this assertion, and it is almost impossibly unlikely. In reality, the development of new ironworking techniques was laborious and expensive, involving much trial and error, end quote. He cites the many difficulties recorded by foundries seeking to improve iron refining processes, adding, quote, even Cort's process required further improvement by other ironmasters before it was widely adopted, end quote. Jelf also objects that the sugar rollers used in Jamaica for crushing sugar canes were not analogous to the rollers used in Henry Cort's iron refining process. He cites a blog post by historian Anton Howes, writing, Howes, quote, points out that these were almost entirely different in function and form, being typically oriented vertically with grooves running down their length rather than horizontally with grooves around, as would be required for the working of iron, end quote. We'll return to Howes' criticisms of Bulstrode's paper later. Jelf also questions Bulstrode's description of Reeder's black foundry workers as metallurgists with the expertise to invent this unique refining process, explaining, quote, there is no record of their specific roles within the foundry, end quote. He acknowledges, quote, African smiths of the day were undoubtedly brilliant artisans, end quote, but adds, quote, whatever skills these men possessed were clearly not immediately suited to European forge work, since British iron workers had to be brought to Jamaica for their training, end quote. Jelf further notes, quote, Bulstrode also fails to remove Reeder himself from the equation, end quote, observing that although Reeder was originally ignorant of ironworking, quote, it does not follow that he remained ignorant, and he very likely gained considerable experience in the decades spent setting up and operating a large iron foundry, end quote. Although this may seem to be rather a weak argument, Jelf supported it somewhat by noting, quote, Reeder was a coppersmith by trade and thus familiar with metalworking in general, end quote, and citing contemporaries of Reeder who praised him as an innovator with ingenuity, quote, uncommon talents, end quote, and, quote, a most active mind, end quote. At the least, it can be acknowledged that if it was possible for Reeder's black iron workers to come up with a new refining process, it was at least possible for Reeder himself to have devised it. Jelf is on stronger ground when he notes that there is no record of Reeder himself ever communicating anything about a radically new process of iron refining which would revolutionize the industry, writing, quote, Reeder, in his letters and papers, never once mentions a new technique for processing iron or any kind of newly developed equipment, end quote. Jelf also observes that although Reeder filed a number of patent applications, quote, he made no such application for any invention relating to wrought iron, end quote, which would be unusual if either he or his staff had come up with such a process. In particular, Jelf notes Reeder never sought damages for intellectual property theft by Henry Cort, which would also be unusual if Cort had stolen an idea invented by either Reeder or his staff. Jelf also critiques Bulstrode's argument that Henry Cort learned of the refining process he patented not through his own innovation, but from familiarity with the practices of Reeder's Foundry. Bulstrode asserts that at a time when Henry Cort was in financial difficulty, he heard of, quote, a foundry where a team of 76 black metallurgists had developed an ingenious way to turn scrap metal into valuable bar iron, end quote. Jelf assesses and critiques this claim, writing, quote, specifically, Bulstrode alleges that a relative of Henry Cort, John Cort, master of the merchant ship Abbey, was in Jamaica at the time and sailed back to Portsmouth with the news, end quote. He further adds, quote, Bulstrode does point to a single brief report in the supplement to the Royal Gazette of Jamaica, end quote, adding, quote, the report makes no mention of the foundry, end quote. Consequently, Jelf concludes this report would have been insufficient for John Cort to have gained the necessary technical information about any new refining process at Reeder's Foundry and passed it on to his brother Henry. Jelf also challenges Bulstrode's claim, which he based on two primary source newspaper reports, that John Cort, having been in Jamaica where he learned of the new refining process at Reeder's Foundry, took a ship called the Abbey, which was originally part of a convoy bound for Lancaster in England, but ended up landing at Portsmouth after changing course due to hull leaks and lack of food. Bulstrode asserts that once John Cort had arrived at Portsmouth, where his brother Henry had his own iron foundry, he met Henry and passed on to him the technical knowledge of the new refining process at Reeder's Foundry. Jelf quotes extensively from the newspaper reports cited by Bulstrode, as well as a letter by the captain of the Princess Royal, one of the ships in the convoy, proving that, though some of the ships landed at Portsmouth, the Abbey, in which John Cort was sailing, landed at the originally intended destination of Lancaster, not Portsmouth. Jelf comments, quote, neither of the sources quoted above is ambiguous, and it is hard to believe that Bulstrode did not comprehend their true meaning when she cited them in support of her case. Each contains a clear refutation of her claim that John Cort sailed to Portsmouth and there told his relative Henry Cort about Reeder's Foundry, end quote. However, Bulstrode also proposed another method by which Henry Cort in Portsmouth, England, could have learnt the technical details of an iron refining process supposedly used by a foundry in Jamaica, quite some distance away. In Jelf's words, quote, Bulstrode's paper alleges that John Reeder's Foundry was demolished under a pretext and its groundbreaking machinery shipped to Henry Cort in Portsmouth, end quote. Jelf himself acknowledges, quote, the foundry certainly was demolished, end quote. Jelf quotes the letter recording the demolition of Reeder's Foundry, which contains no clear reference to the transportation to Portsmouth of the foundry's machinery for the unique refining process. The letter says, quote, such of the stock as might be useful to the enemy, end quote, was put on ships bound for England. Martial law had recently been imposed in Jamaica as the island was considered to be under threat of invasion by European powers, the enemy to which the letter refers. But there's no clear evidence in this record that any special refining machinery was transported. In fact, Bulstrode herself quotes Reeder's own letter describing how, in Bulstrode's words, quote, his machinery for making bar iron, end quote, was rendered, quote, totally useless, end quote, indicating that the machinery and tools for the iron refining were destroyed rather than being sent to England. Jelf notes that in his own letters requesting recompense for the destruction of his foundry, Reeder, quote, does not say those that were taken away, and not one of his letters, nor any of his numerous and detailed applications for compensation, suggest that any part of his foundry was ever removed from Jamaica, end quote. On the 29th of August 2023, a blog post by historian Anton Howes, cited previously, also critiqued Bulstrode's paper, focusing mainly on what Howes regarded as gaps of evidence in Bulstrode's chain of reasoning. This is, of course, a blog post, not a peer-reviewed paper, but it is still the assessment of a historian in a relevant field. Howes wrote, quote, Bulstrode's narrative requires multiple smoking guns to work, none of which are in the evidence she presents, end quote. Howes proceeds to list these smoking guns. Firstly, he states, quote, there is no evidence presented that Reeder's works were commercially successful because of a newly invented process. Contrast with Cort's lack of success is not sufficient, as the commercial context was radically different, using different materials, unfree labour, and selling to a different market, end quote. Secondly, he observes Bulstrode provided no evidence that any of Reeder's workers invented such a process, writing, quote, Bulstrode does show that many of these workers were skilled in metallurgy, but skill is not always a prerequisite to invention, end quote. Thirdly, he notes that even if such a process was invented by Reeder's black workers, quote, Bulstrode presents no evidence that this specific group used iron bundles at all, let alone in such a process, end quote. Adding, quote, nor that the invention was derived from passing iron bundles through grooved sugarcane rollers, end quote. Addressing Bulstrode's claim that Reeder's foundry had both air furnaces and rollers, and that Reeder could have used grooved rollers for iron inspired by the grooved rollers already used in sugar production, Bulstrode writes that this alone is insufficient to prove such inspiration occurred, noting, quote, Bulstrode makes no comment on the size or shape or configuration of the grooves, end quote. In particular, Howes notes that sugar mill rollers could be either vertical or horizontal, though he says, quote, but they're almost always shown vertically, end quote. More importantly, he adds, quote, the grooves run along the entire length of the rollers, end quote. In contrast, he writes, quote, rollers of iron, by necessity, were always horizontal, end quote. Howes further adds that the grooves in iron rollers were around the width of the rollers, unlike the sugarcane rollers in which the grooves were along the length. He argues that this structural difference was a result of the rollers being used for two completely different purposes. Sugar rollers were used for crushing brittle material, whereas iron rollers were used for extruding soft material. Fourthly, Howes argues that even if the grooved rollers for sugar and iron production both had grooves around the width, and even if Reeder's foundry did use them for iron refining, there is still no evidence for the technical details of such a process being transmitted from Reeder's foundry to Henry Cort. Finally, Howes asserts there is no evidence that Henry Cort was responsible for the closing of Reeder's factory, and observes Bulstrode provides no evidence, quote, that any machinery or tools was seized from the Reeder works rather than destroyed, end quote, adding, quote, nor that any machinery or tools were transferred specifically to Portsmouth. And even supposing that any machinery or tools from Reeder's works were transferred to Portsmouth, there is no evidence that they were made available to Cort, end quote. Howes concludes his article by commenting, quote, we lack much other evidence of how Cort arrived at his grooved rolling process, but the absence of an alternative narrative is not itself evidence of conspiracy. Frankly, we still know so little in general about nearly all inventions of the period, end quote. Additional commentary on the article occurred around the same time, which I will summarise briefly. On the 2nd of September 2023, British journalist Ian Leslie commented on the situation, citing the critique of Howes, which he said, quote, noted the almost total lack of evidence for the paper's central claims, end quote, and on Jelf's article, which he said, quote, provides the most thorough debunking of it imaginable, end quote. Leslie's own article is less of a commentary on the history and more a journalist's opinion on the historiographical methods used by Bulstrode and on what he sees as ideological bias among modern historians. It's worth noting he's a journalist, not a professional in the field. On the 28th of September 2023, Professor of History David Wootton published a blog post, cited previously, in which he reviewed Howes and Jelf's critiques of Bulstrode's paper, agreed with both of them, and offered his own comments on how and why, in his view, Bulstrode's claims had exceeded the available historical evidence. This article is a blog post and largely an opinion piece, but still offers a professional historian's insights into the historiographical method and academic disputes. The editor's defence of Bulstrode. Several other critiques of Bulstrode's paper were publicised, most by academics, some in good faith and others clearly motivated by defence of the British Empire. On the 3rd of October 2023, the non-partisan British organisation Committee for Academic Freedom announced that Bulstrode's research and paper would be investigated by the journal in which it was published, along with the journal's publisher, explaining, quote, there are, in summary, 3 charges against Dr. Bulstrode. That her theory goes far beyond the evidence provided by her sources. That passages of her sources contradict her theory. That she was motivated by an ideological desire to attack the British Empire, end quote. On the 15th of November 2023, the editors of the journal in which Bulstrode's paper had been published made a public statement overwhelmingly supporting her work, though adding some qualifying statements. Firstly, the editors vindicated Bulstrode's historical finding that, quote, black metallurgists of Reeder's foundry had worked scrap metal for many generations, used rollers to produce iron goods, produced iron-grooved rollers for use on sugar plantations, made the same iron products that Henry Cort produced in Portsmouth, and were only too well acquainted with feeding sugarcane through iron rollers." End quote. Rather more tentatively, the editors argued that since, quote, "there were significant connections between Portsmouth, where Cort operated, and Jamaica, established through the Royal Navy," end quote, and since Henry Cort's patent, quote, "focused on the very particular practice of feeding bundles of scrap iron through rollers, for which there was no previous European tradition," end quote, then, quote, "the historian is entitled to argue that Cort learned this practice from Jamaican black metallurgists," end quote. Note the careful wording. The editors are supporting this as a historically credible claim to make, rather than affirming it actually happened. The editors acknowledged, quote, "there is no direct reference in any source quoted by Bulstrode or in the archaeological record to grooved rollers used to work iron at John Reeder's foundry," end quote, but did point out that grooved rollers were already being used for some kinds of ironworking, and that iron-grooved rollers were being used locally for sugarcane processing. Consequently, the editors wrote, quote, "it is safe to assume black metallurgists working at Reeder's Pen, the main foundry in Jamaica, in the early 1780s, produced both types of iron rollers, horizontal and vertical. As was common at the time, and as the sources quoted by Bulstrode suggest, they also had horizontal mills to work iron," end quote. The editors further noted that there was, quote, "evidence of the existence at Reeder's foundry in Jamaica of rolls for the preparation of both sugar and metal with the same shapes, materials, and layout, and, more importantly, of a very common practice of passing bundled things through them," end quote. Therefore, they wrote, quote, "it is thus sound to conclude, as Bulstrode does, that people who were so familiar with both sugar and iron production overlapped in their approaches to the two operations and passed bundles of scrap iron through grooved rollers," end quote. Note again the careful wording. The editors argue for the legitimacy of Bulstrode's logical chain of reasoning without declaring explicitly that the historical events actually transpired the way she proposes. They then provided another qualification, acknowledging, quote, "the historical record does not provide, again, any immediate proof that Cort knew about what was going on at Reeder's foundry," end quote, while still arguing that Bulstrode had provided enough evidence, quote, "sustaining the inference of the existence of knowledge travelling between the two geographies," end quote. Note again the emphasis is on the legitimacy of Bulstrode's process of inferencing and extrapolation on the basis of what is known, without declaring dogmatically that the conclusions she draws from her inference and extrapolation are necessarily correct. The editors made stronger statements on Bulstrode's assertion that Reeder's special refining equipment had been transported to England, saying her description of the foundry's dismantling, quote, "reinforces the importance of considering the historical connections between Jamaica and Portsmouth," end quote. The editors disagreed that the stock cited in primary sources as having been transported to England did not refer to machinery relating to the refinery of iron in Reeder's foundry. Instead, they argue, since the primary sources cited, quote, "utensils for sugar plantations," end quote, and since this included grooved rollers for sugar processing, these could have been included in the items shipped back to England, where they may have inspired Henry Cort's use of them in iron refining, noting, quote, "the core of the patent case put forth by Henry Cort was not new machinery, but the specific practice of feeding bundled scrap iron through grooved rollers," end quote. Broader scholarly discussion. The journal's editorial settled the issue for many, with the British Society for the History of Science making its own public statement, quote, "fully supporting Dr. Bulstrode's analyses of black metallurgists' technologies and material cultures," end quote. However, Bulstrode's paper and the controversy over its accuracy continued to be discussed over the next couple of years. On the 23rd of November 2023, Ian Leslie wrote a lengthy article entitled "The End of History," in which he critiqued the editor's defense of Bulstrode's paper and commented on what he perceived as political bias in modern historiography. On the 28th of November 2023, Anton Howes wrote a blog post entitled "How to Be a Public Historian," in which he commented in depth on the interaction of scholarly publications with both the media and the public, the responsibilities professional historians have when encountering what they consider to be historically inaccurate claims in the public domain, and the appropriate methods for addressing such claims. This was quite an insightful piece. On the 12th of December 2023, historian Lawrence Goldman wrote a blog post on Bulstrode's paper entitled Dr. Bulstrode on Black Metallurgists and the Industrial Revolution on History Reclaimed, a website containing right-wing historical content and apologia for the British Empire. Predictably, Goldman reviewed Bulstrode's work unfavourably, appealing to the critiques of Howes and Jelf, while also citing the articles by Wootton and Leslie. Goldman's article is more of an example of the current state of the history-culture wars in Britain than a formal historical analysis. On the 30th of November 2024, economist Noah Smith wrote an opinion piece on his website entitled Politicised Science Inevitably Trends Towards Pseudoscience, commenting on the paper and its aftermath. This is very much an outsider's perspective from a liberal economist, and Bulstrode's paper is used by Smith as an example of what he considers to be historical narrative motivated by politics. You can guess the overall theme of the article from its title. Remember, this is an opinion piece by a non-historian. Most recently, Jelf wrote a response to the editor's defence of Bulstrode, again submitting it for publication, again being declined, and again publishing it on SOC Archive. In fact, just this month, on the 22nd of February 2025. In this article, Jelf not only critiqued the editorial commentary defending Bulstrode, but examined Bulstrode's sources in even greater detail, concluding, quote, by exploring in depth the historical context, technological details, and primary sources relating to Bulstrode's claim, this study demonstrates that her account remains unproven, end quote. Who should we believe? When historians line up on two sides of an issue and professional scholars disagree on an interpretation of historical data, who should the unqualified individual believe? What should those of us who are untrained to assess historical sources do in response to such situations? We've seen in this case a professional historian charged with extrapolating well beyond the evidence of their sources, so as non-professionals we should be even more cautious of coming to firm opinions on issues over which academics disagree. Additionally, we also need to be aware of our own biases, which may incline us to favour one position over another. But aside from that, we should identify the reason for the scholarly disagreement and what form it takes. In this particular case, a strong claim was made about a historical event by Bulstrode. Her critics insisted the sources she cited did not support her claim, and even her strongest defenders acknowledged that at least some of her sources did not provide direct support for her claim, while still arguing that her arguments were logically valid and historically plausible. So the issue in this case isn't as simple as deciding whether or not Bulstrode is correct to argue Henry Cort stole his iron refining method from Reeder's black ironworkers, and we don't really need to take a side and represent it as fact. We could absolutely have an opinion, and we could express that opinion as strongly as we wanted, but we should express it very distinctly as an opinion and not as a fact. We should mention that Bulstrode believes her interpretation of the history is factual, but we should also mention the alternative scholarly views, especially the editorial view that Bulstrode's argument is logically sound and historically plausible, but not necessarily established fact. I don't have a problem saying I don't find Bulstrode's case convincing, though this is due in part to the fact that I'm fairly conservative when it comes to interpreting sources and believe that the greater the scale of the historical claim made and the more individuals and factors it involves, the greater the burden of evidence it must meet. But I only express this as the opinion of a non-professional and unqualified commenter. But there's another issue to consider here, and that is the reason why even professional historians sometimes disagree over the past, in particular over their interpretation of the evidence. Isn't this a problem for the credibility of historians? What can be done about this? On the 19th of August 2023, Howes made a blog post entitled, Does History Have a Replication Crisis?, drawing a comparison between the so-called replication crisis in social science and the problem of history publications citing sources which do not actually support the arguments for which they are cited. Howes called for more effort to be made to read the sources cited in history publications, stating that if they were being cited accurately and genuinely supported the argument for which they were being cited, then an independent reader could check the sources and find the same information as the authors citing them. This is what he meant by replication. In his article, Howes used several examples of authors whose cited sources did not support the claims they made, including Bulstrode's article, writing, quote, "In science terms, if you were to read those same sources before reading Bulstrode's arguments, there is absolutely no way that you would derive the same conclusions as her," end quote. In Howes' view, Bulstrode's article did not pass the replication test. Howes proposed that, quote, "Just as in the sciences it is considered good practice to make one's data available, in history it should perhaps be a requirement to upload to some public repository the photographs or transcriptions of any cited archival sources that are not otherwise freely accessible online. This would not only help peer reviewers assess a historian's narrative, something that they frankly cannot do without going and reviewing those same sources for themselves, but would also hugely accelerate the rate at which historical work is digitized and made more available," end quote. It should be noted that Howes' blog post is an opinion piece, not a scholarly work, yet it is a professional's considered analysis of an existing problem in historical studies and academic history publications. On the 4th of October 2024, historian Dan Oloso replied to Howes on his own blog in an article entitled "History Does Not Have a Replication Problem." Oloso declared his views at the start of his article, writing, quote, "I think Anton either exaggerated or misunderstood some central elements of how history is done, but I completely agree with his conclusion," end quote. Oloso made the point that historical analysis relies on interpretation in a way that science does not, stating, quote, "The assumption I think is implied here seems to be that two historians looking at the same data ought to see the same things and come to the same conclusions about causality, importance, and interpretation," end quote, and adding, quote, "I think this sort of misstates what history is about and how it differs from science," end quote. He observed that whereas science is able to make reliable generalizations based on the observations of experiences which repeat consistently under certain conditions, such as water always boiling at a certain temperature, historical analysis is not the same, since the subject of its analysis is not the same, commenting, quote, "I can't think of a lot of historical events that could be understood in this way," end quote. Nevertheless, despite these and other criticisms and qualifications of Howes' view of historical analysis, Oloso concluded, quote, "The solution Howes proposes is brilliant. I am 1000% in favour of historians actually making the archival sources they use available to the public," end quote. Howes' suggestion is well in line with good historiographical method as recommended by the American Historical Association. The AHA's Statement on Standards of Professional Conduct says, quote, "Honouring the historical record also means leaving a clear trail for subsequent historians to follow," end quote, explaining that recording the use of sources and apparatuses such as bibliographies and institutional repositories, quote, "enables other historians to retrace the steps in an argument to make sure those steps are justified by the sources." This idea is very similar to Howes' view of replication. I believe the most important lesson to learn from this scholarly disagreement is the importance of post-publication peer review. Just because a paper is published in a reputable peer-reviewed journal does not mean it is correct. In fact, being published in such a journal is really only the start of the peer review process, not the end. The true test commences when a paper is examined by a broader range of the author's professional peers, subsequent to publication. In the case of Bulstrode's article, that process is still ongoing, and although there are historians who have already taken a side on the issue, there are good reasons for non-professionals to be cautious in the expression of their own opinion on who is right and wrong.